Good morning, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk about things that you don't know you don't know. You may have heard Donald Rumsfeld at one time refer to unknown unknowns and known unknowns, things you know you don't know. And he was interviewed in 2013 about the events and the judgment leading up to the Iraq War. And the interviewer at the time said, "Mr. Secretary, doesn't it seem a little amazing to you that you missed so much, that things that were sort of obvious right out in plain view in retrospect could have been so helpful in your decision making?" And those of you that are familiar with this secretary know that he has a sardonic wit and a bit of unvarnished sarcasm many times. And he sort of, with that twinkle, grandfatherly look, looks at the interviewer and says, "Well, of course, in retrospect, everything is amazing." And I think we all have that experience about obsolescence all the time, where in hindsight, and the benefit of hindsight, we're able to see things that were there all the time and there, but for our own blindness, we failed to act. Now, I'm not sure how well that shows up, but there's a smudge in the middle of this slide, and it's actually a picture of the unceremonious landing site from 2016 of the European Schiaparelli lander, which sadly was the victim of a blind spot and a failure of imagination. The engineers in this case just didn't think about the fact that as the lunar lander or the Mars lander was approaching the Mars atmosphere, the amount of information that was going to be coming into the CPU was going to be monumental, and the CPU might essentially fail to capture all that data, which is exactly what happened. It occurred for about 1 second. The aircraft thought that it was about 20 meters off the ground, fired the retro rockets, and jettisoned the parachute at 15,000 feet, at which point it plummeted, and they estimate that it hit the Martian surface at about 350 miles an hour. So it's not that the engineers weren't good, it's not that they did their job, it was this idea that they couldn't imagine every possible eventuality. And I think in my job at Aero, I see this happen maybe more often than I like, and it's sad to see a customer literally brought to their knees begging for parts that are gone, and that the CEO or their boss has become an expediter. And on more than one occasion, I've had customers call me and say, "You know, I really wish I could go back about 5 years and have a do-over and maybe buy some more parts." It's started to seem sort of obvious to me that this, which admittedly is a patently self-serving comment for a distributor to make, but it's really, really true. We get caught up in the idea that an extra 50 parts or an extra 100 parts is going to really get us in trouble. But year after year, I see customers come back to me and talk about how it was obvious from the beginning that they were going to need more parts than they actually bought. And it was maybe a failure of imagination, a failure of courage. In that case, maybe a known unknown that they failed to deal with. And so A&D customers have seemed to grapple with this a little bit better than maybe the broad market. It's been part of their world from the beginning, and so for a long time it looked like A&D was going to get ahead of this problem. But then we saw some macroeconomic shifts in the global economy that sort of made this harder, and as I think a couple of the speakers have already commented, this massive wave of M&A. In 2005, I had the honor and pleasure of running sales at Aero's military high-rel business unit. And when I got there, I'd come from a broad global business background, and it was really obvious to me that this group of customers had some very specific challenges that they had to deal with every day. Sustainability that had to go on forever, and this concept of system interoperability, which I really underestimated in terms of its complexity and the challenges that it represents, some of the things around software obsolescence especially. But the idea that these things not only have to be around, but they have to work with other things that also have to be around for a long time. And so back in 2005, A&D was really grappling with this all the time. Move ahead then, just after the Great Global Recession, 2011, and all of a sudden you have semiconductor manufacturers having to work really hard on their operating expense, and a sort of mini wave of obsolescence as these companies started some pretty aggressive rationalization activities. But that was nothing compared to what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And this M&A tidal wave, where now everybody in the business has to deal with obsolescence. And so how are we as a supplier, a partner, in many cases a coach, going to help those customers deal with that problem? Those of you that know me may know I have this penchant to avoid the idea of shoulding on people. I think I got that from a parenting class 23 years ago, where they really encourage you not to tell people what they should do, but maybe give them choices and ideas about what directions they might go. But I think in this case it's probably warranted. We see things happen all the time, and like I've said, it's not because they're bad people, it's just because a helpful model maybe hasn't been made visible. And I don't know if it's good or bad, but I think about this all day, every day. And what occurred to me is there's this amazing symmetry that we're trying to form when we make decisions like this. And it's having an equal measure of the things that we know we have to consider, and that they're all presented to us at the same time. In the case of a lifetime buy decision, that would include a long-term forecast. And I can imagine many of you are sort of rolling your eyes or thinking about rolling your eyes. But in fact, I know that ERP and even some statutory limits mean you don't have an actual forecast, but most of the things that we support are expected to be around for a considerable period of time, and we even have a very close estimate of how many of those things we're going to build. Think about certain missile programs or commercial aircraft programs. So it's not hard to come up with something that's even better than a rough order of magnitude estimate of what you're going to need. Delivery and supply chain plans have to consider the fact that in many cases this stuff has to be supported by contract manufacturing, and contract manufacturers have limitations. I don't mean to disparage CMs in any way by saying that, but to point out what's probably obvious, that this is a really working capital intensive problem. And asking a contract manufacturer that has a 2-year service agreement with you to deal with your 20-year-old problem or 20-year-long problem may not be entirely realistic. And then finally, proactive mature consideration of the open market, that this is a reasonable and logical approach to long-term shortage mitigation, and thinking about when that becomes integrated into your strategy is really important. And so this probably sounds a lot like motherhood and apple pie. But this is what usually happens, right? Human beings do what they know, they deal with what they can see. And in the case of LTVs, this manifests itself in a discussion that very, very quickly ends up in price and delivery. So we take this very complex idea and distill it down to the end of the story. Forecasts are shortened, evaluated in a window we know is too small. Delivery plans through our contract manufacturing partners are delegated over to the EMS without a long-term agreement that's going to help them mitigate their capital risk. And aftermarket very often becomes an afterthought or something that's sort of neglected altogether. And so what you end up with is this really asymmetrical decision-making process. Buyers and planners don't have all the information they need at the time that these events occur, and a big part of the strategy is sort of ignored. And so at Arrow, we probably see this problem at a scale that few of you could comprehend. And think about it. We have 20,000 active global customers for components. We saw 100,000 LTB notifications in 2016. Just imagine how that propagates through our customer base. And so we worked very hard to see if there are things that we can do to make that decision-making process scalable, and we did it. We built a platform that allows us to see all of the global EOL activity as well as the usage data, and we've been using it now for 3 years to make risk-based decisions on a very, very systematic and scalable business. So Alice is Arrow's Lifecycle Intelligence Service. It's our intent to make this available to customers. I apologize, I don't really mean to be pitching right now, but I think this is a great example of how we can make solutions tangible based on what we've learned trying to work through this problem for the last 23 years. What we've done is take 10 years of Arrow global usage data and drop it into a big data framework. If there's IT geeks in the house, it's a Hadoop HDFS framework running with Hive, and we're using something called ClickSense, which makes pretty graphs, but it also helps us pull in all of the data. What's important about this is we're integrating all of Arrow's risk analysis algorithms in this process. What you see here is a market score, a customer count score, so we're sort of quantifying. And then for many of you, your multi-site companies, we can present this for every active site that you have. The idea here is you can now see things you didn't know you needed to know. So these histograms are probably a little bit easier to interpret. The one there on your left at the top describes the number of customers buying a part during any given month for the last 2 years. We did actually use some machine learning techniques this summer with an intern that I had to test our own models and sort of proved what we already knew in our gut, which is that customer count really matters, but we actually quantified how much it actually matters. And so if you're buying a product and there are, as in this example, 23, 24, maybe up to 30, that's actually a pretty good population of active users. But the reality is 70% of Arrow's parts are only bought by 3 customers. And by the time they get to EOL, you might be the only one, but you have no way of knowing that unknown unknown. And so Alice is an exceptional tool for helping us see blind spots here. The histogram on the right is a close cousin to the customer count. It's this idea of customer concentration. So even if you have a broad customer population, knowing how concentrated it is to a few customers is really important. So we've done that. And then something that's a little hard to see, but conceptually I'll talk about it at the bottom, this idea of cadence. Many of you support programs that only buy products or only get funded every 3 or 4 years. And so the consumption pattern on those is very, very inconsistent. And so from a risk standpoint, what we look for is parts that have a normal cadence. We don't worry so much about the duration or the period. What we worry about is the consistency, right? So any of you that took statistics in school probably sort of having a little bit of a flashback on some of this stuff, but that's really what's going on here. And so when we talk about risk, we're talking about the risk that there's not going to be a customer. For you, it's the same thing. I've told a lot of people, this is like taking a telescope and just looking through it backwards. And for you, being able to see this is understanding whether or not a part's going to be available in the open market, being able to anticipate whether or not you're likely to have an alternate source for this in terms of another prime contractor or a franchise distributor. Not knowing that, most customers don't know that. In fact, I don't know of one that does today. People are making decisions about what to buy blind. And I'll give you one quick story. There was a major FPGA LTB, see if I can do this whole sentence in acronyms, LTB in EMEA, and I went and traveled around, met a lot of customers and talked about it. And I would sit down with them and pull up their data on Alice. It literally took a minute. And with that exception, when they saw that they were the only customer buying these parts, their jaws dropped. But then you could see the sort of light go on. And it was this understanding, aha, now I have a way of explaining risk to my boss, or to finance, or to the end customer. This is one of the things, it's not the only thing, but this is one of the things that has been completely opaque to the customer base, which we've had for a long, long time. So like Enda said, what we're trying to do is create tools that help us all actually solve this problem. So what's in it for us, right? It kind of goes back to that self-serving slide. I think you do end up in a situation where the safest rational decision is to probably buy more parts. And that's probably good for us and for the manufacturers. But at the end of the day, it's going to be better for you and better for our customers. My dad is a scientist from Caltech at China Lake, about 150 miles from here. And as a kid, I would watch him use this tool, his slide rule or his slipstick, and I was amazed at how well he could go through and do really complex stuff for trigonometry, geometry, and sort of simple maybe more complex multiplication and division. And this is very similar to what happens with a lot of your people today, and some of you. You're experts at a rudimentary system. And that rudimentary system serves scientists and engineers for decades, but we have to move on. And so when you go back to your organization, think about the rudimentary systems that you've probably depended on for an incredible long period of time, and how those can be better. How can you comprehend the things now that you know you don't know and integrate that into your decision-making process? Alice is a start. It's not the only thing. There's a lot more that we have to do. Software and people are incredibly important to this problem. But I think we've got to start. And I'm proud of the fact that I think we have an actual solution to the problem. So thank you.